Hello and welcome to First Chapter Friday. My name is Eva. I'm one of the librarians at the Alameda Free Library, and the book that I have for you today is, well, it's gross. It's called Something Rotten, A Fresh Look at Roadkill, and it's by Heather L. Montgomery and illustrated by Kevin O'Malley. And if you, when you heard the name of this book, immediately thought, ew, well, you're definitely on the right track. There is nothing sunshine and daffodils about this book, but it is fascinating. I'm going to start with a note from the author. Here it is, a note from me, the author. And then I'm going to slide into chapter 1 so that you can see how the book begins. Here we go. A note from me, the author. This is where the magic happens, said my guide, a tanned man who looked out from under a Crocodile Dundee-style hat. He swung open the lid of a 6-foot-long white chest freezer, a freezer that reminded me of a coffin. A skull stared up at me. Deep black holes that once were eyes seemed to issue a challenge. Come closer. So I inched one tiny step forward and peeked inside the freezer. Rotting body parts lay in a jumble, a rib cage half covered in decaying skin, vertebrae lying on their side, looking like warped crosses, a flat bone the shape of a butterfly. The bones weren't human. The bones weren't chicken or ham or beef, what you would expect to find in a freezer. The bones were from various small animals, and they filled plastic bins, open egg cartons, and orange cafeteria trays. A miniature body, now just a curled cluster of calcium, nestled into one cup of an egg carton. The tidy line of its spine, the C-shaped noodles that must be ribs, and a teeny tiny rodent skull. The bones were the reason I had hopped into my car and driven across my home state of Alabama to interview this scientist, David Laurencio. The bones, which were mostly from roadkill, were the root of my burning question. How do you use roadkill? It might sound like an odd question, but when my curiosity takes a hold, it takes over. And on the topic of roadkill, I was way beyond curious. I was obsessed. Every dead animal along the road stirred up questions. What actually happened to those animals? Does anyone ever pick them up? If so, what do they do with them? Why did the chicken, fox, deer try to cross the road in the first place? What if an animal is injured but not killed? How many animals are killed by vehicles every year? And why aren't we doing anything about it? My fluffy yellow dog Piper is my travel companion, so she heard lots and lots of questions. I wonder if she had questions too. I didn't want to be asking these questions. The topic was too sad, too tragic, too disgusting to think about for very long. But I had been pulling my car off the road to peer at poor dead animals for years. Does my degree in biology give me an excuse for that? The death of those wild creatures was depressing, but their bodies were fascinating. Each carcass was an opportunity to get close to wildlife, to touch velvety bobcat fur, to wonder at the miracle of muscles inside a deer, and to run a finger over a snapping turtle's jagged spine. For years, it was like two different people waged a tug of war inside me, one repelled by the bloody body, and one reaching toward it, until one day I gave in and let the questions take over. That's why I was visiting David's Library of Dead Bodies. David is collection manager of tetrapods for Auburn University's Museum of Natural History. He took me to see this warm freezer where he turned corpses into skeletal specimens that wouldn't stink, rot, or get munched on. You might be wondering why the freezer was warm. David had his reasons. I'll tell you about those and the 1,000 or so bugs crawling all over the skeletons in chapter 2. Visiting with David, I realized something. There are other people just as intrigued by this topic. Others who find productive uses for those dead bodies. Others who care. Little did I know then just how deep I would go, elbow deep at times, into this roadkill research. Warning, this book is not for squeamish souls. It's full of lung-eating parasites, ropes of intestines, and of course, bloody bodies. The scientist in chapter 2 who pulls squiggly things out of road-killed snakes, is she squeamish? No. Disgusting didn't stop her. This book is not for reckless readers. It's full of things you shouldn't do, not at least until you are an authorized, bona fide, certified expert. I'm serious. You could catch Lyme disease, end up with a parasite in your eye, become roadkill yourself. Rubber gloves can't protect you from everything. The 11-year-old in chapter 6 who rebuilt a giraffe from the bones up, he's got years of experience, his parents' support, and if he lived in the U.S., he'd likely need a government permit. This book is not for the tender-hearted. It's full of death, decay, and decomposition, and it's full of tragedy. Wildlife vehicle collisions kill over 1 million animals a day, and that's just in the United States. When I heard how many animals were dying, I wondered if we had to sit around and watch it happen. I asked even more questions, visited people who work with roadkill, and put my own hands on those bodies. While I was touring a wildlife disease center, a veterinarian student said to me, "Roadkill? It's not the end of the story." What did she mean? What stories could roadkill tell? So I began to let myself look and touch and listen and smell. I found many others who did too, others who, through looking directly at the tragedy, turned it into triumph. A scientist who now understands cancer better, citizens who track where wildlife cross the road, scientists who are halting extinctions, kids who make art, all thanks to roadkill. That is what this book is about, the discoveries, ingenuity, and hope that have been inspired by roadkill. And it all started with one squished snake. Chapter 1, Rattled. There it was, sprawled out on the pavement in front of me, a rattlesnake as long as my arm, with a squished midsection as wide as a car tire. So sad. As I jogged past, I wondered if the driver had aimed for the snake. Then a question hit me. When a rattler closes his mouth, how does he not bite himself? Think about it. His fangs are really long. Where do they go? How come they don't jab his lower lip? I mean, I knew the anatomical reason from reading a book. The fangs fold, but I still didn't get how. That question grabbed a hold of me and wouldn't let go. A quarter of a mile down my little country lane, how, was still echoing inside my head. So I turned back around and soon I was jogging in place, staring down at the snake. There was only one way to find out. This is the part you don't do at home. The part that even I was nervous about doing. And I'd been trained in how to safely handle snakes. The part that might be illegal, except that I had permission. The part that could get me killed. I picked it up. Right there in the middle of the road, I bent down to pick up that rattler with my bare hands. I know. I should have worn gloves. But who carries rubber gloves when they go out for a run? Now, to look at his head, you'd never know he was dead. His eyes were staring directly at me. I had poked the snake once, twice, 3 times with a stick to make sure he was dead. We never expect to look into the eyes of the dead, but a rattler's eyes never close. They don't have eyelids like ours, just a clear scale that covers each eye to protect it from the claws of their prey. I grasped firmly behind the head where his fangs couldn't reach. Even a dead rattler can bite and inject venom. His venom was still there, waiting expectantly in glands in his cheeks. His muscles were still ready to contract, waiting to squeeze those venom glands. His fangs, as finely tipped as a nurse's needle, were still sharp, waiting, waiting, waiting. The only thing missing was a message from a nerve cell. A live nerve cell actively pumps sodium ions through the cell membranes to the outside. Because the sodium ions have a positive charge, the inside of the cell is left with a negative charge. When the nerve is triggered, on a live or dead snake, the cell membrane opens and lets the sodium ions rush back in. This sends an electrical impulse to the muscles. Contract! Freshly dead, this rattler's nerve cells were still primed and ready to send a message. Very carefully, I opened his mouth, and I closed it, and I opened it, and I closed it. What I had read about him having foldable fangs began to make sense. With his mouth wide open, his fangs are flung out from the top jaw right there in your face, needle sharp, raised and ready to pierce soft skin. But close the mouth, and the tips of those fangs begin to fold in backward toward the throat. Spring the mouth open and closed, and you'll see a pink sheath like a triangle of tissue running from the back to the front of the top gun and down the fang. When the mouth is open, the tissue is no longer a triangle. It's bunched up at the top of the fang like a sleeve pushed up to your elbow. The fang extends out of that tissue. As you close the jaw, that sleeve slides down to cover the curved fang and then seems to tug at it. That must be what guides the fang, I thought, what eases it back into its folded position. By the time the mouth is closed, all but a whisper, the fangs have vanished. I opened the mouth again and noticed something strange, something that looked like a little slit. It wasn't the esophagus, which was a normal-looking hole at the very back of his mouth. This slit was in the center of the floor of his mouth. My degree was in general biology, not herpetology, so I'd never studied snake anatomy. The question came boiling out of me. What is that? Why is it there? Is it normal? Why don't I have one? Do all snakes have those? I had to know. Here's the second thing you shouldn't try yourself. Now, I can deal with gross stuff, but spit wigs me out. So it took some nerve, but I stuck my pinky into that rattler's mouth. The floor of the mouth was gushy, like mine would feel, I guess, to a giant poking his finger in my mouth. But that little slit wasn't. In fact, it felt kind of hard. Under the flesh was a tube, as if the slit were the end of a miniature PVC pipe. But where did it go? And what was it for? Did it lead to the stomach? Where? I had to know. So I did yet another thing you shouldn't do. I carried that rattler home. And that is where I will end Something Rotten, a fresh look at Roadkill by Heather L. Montgomery, illustrated by Kevin O'Malley. I hope that you will check this book out because it gets even more interesting, even more juicy and gushy and gross as you go along, but you'll learn so much about those poor dead animals that you drive past on the highway. All right, here you go. Give it a try, and I'll see you next time for more nonfiction. Bye-bye.